David Karakos, who joins me now from Dnipro in Ukraine. He is the author of War in 140 Characters. David, good to have you on the show. I want to take a little bit of a different angle with you. You published a book several years back before the start of this conflict, and you look at sort of how social media is shifting the power balance from governments and institutions over to individuals. You are there right now. Tell me what you're seeing and how it's affecting everything.
Yeah, sorry. First thing I should say, I've actually left now. I left recently. I'm actually back in London.
Okay.
But look, I was there throughout the south, and I was in Odessa. I was in Dnipro, which is kind of in the east. I was on the eastern front, the northern front, and the southern front. I mean, look, it's very intense. This is not the paramilitary fight that was Yugoslavia. It is not the cave battle of Afghanistan. It is not the counterinsurgency of Iraq. This is army versus army, state versus state, tanks, in the streets. In many places, dead children in cities, air raid sirens, those called in many times. This is a very, very serious war, and people are suffering accordingly. It's a very bad situation there.
Social media users don't just watch these events fold in real time. They react to it. They interact with them. How do you think this is sort of changing everything, the sentiment?
Well, it's a very good question. Now, when I first entered Ukraine in 2014, it was clear that the Russian social media game was the only game in town, really. And what they were doing was using it to destabilize Ukraine so it could never sort of progress enough to join the EU and NATO. Now things are very different. And what has happened is that, Russia's invaded full-on military. And you've seen the Ukrainian social media game step up, all based around the figure of Zelensky. And it's been very effective because, communications don't affect war directly. The war on the ground is always the most important thing, but communications affects policy, and policy affects war because it brings in Stinger missiles and javelins and NLAWs and all the other things Ukrainians have been using to defeat the Russian army. Now, what is happening now, however, is that people think that, Russia has lost the information war, because if you look at Russian media, RT, etc., they weren't even bothering to make the case for war. But what it has actually done is it actually turned its attention to other parts of the world, to Africa, for example. That grain piece you had on just before me was very instructive. Ukrainian grain is being blocked from coming out, and countries like Africa are by July, and I wrote about this, facing a huge food security issue. And the Russians are telling them that it is the fault of the West and the fault of Ukraine that they're facing those issues. The social media propaganda is still very much central to this war.
It may be central to this war, but when you're talking about social media, disinformation, fake news comes into play. I mean, you have to talk about ethics and credibility when you look at sort of the sheer volume of information that's put out there.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. And especially in wartime, because in wartime, wartime, as they say, treated as the first casualty of war. It's extremely hard to understand what is happening at the best of times because things are confused. So, social media, bear in mind, platforms like Twitter are where a lot of the world's journalists follow events in crises, especially in real time. So you get very confused messages, and issues of credibility, issues of ethics become even murkier than they usually are. But I want to impress upon people that, Russia is still manipulating, is still employing disinformation, is still manipulating the truth. The fact that we see less of it in Europe and America only means not that it is over, but it's doing it elsewhere. And we are going to see the consequences of that very, very soon with issues like grain. It's very, very serious.
David Karakos, thank you very much for joining us from London. Thank you very much for that correction.